Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. If you clicked on this video, there's probably a pretty good chance that you're new to Monster Hunter as a series with wilds and are either overwhelmed or unfamiliar with each of the 14 weapon types. That's okay though, as they are all very complex weapons, even sometimes being deceptively complex in cases like the Greatsword. These weapons provide, and I cannot exaggerate this enough, an entirely unique way of playing Monster Hunter from one another. And choosing a weapon that's right for you is essential to your enjoyment with the game. I've seen plenty of new hunters pick up the game and try out a weapon that they didn't really vibe with, and they ended up really disliking the game because of it. Of those people, some of them have returned and tried out a weapon that was right for them, and they ended up being immediately hooked on the series. I do want to make it clear that this video's purpose is not to provide a detailed guide on how to master each weapon, as there are people far more experienced and knowledgeable on the complexities of each weapon, down to the frame data in their movesets. But instead, this video will serve as a showcase for each of the weapons and their corresponding playstyles to give you a foot in the door and find the weapon that's right for you. Also, it's very important to mention that every single weapon in the game is viable, and yes, contrary to popular belief, that includes hunting horn as well, even for a solo hunting experience. But without further ado, let's get started with the Greatsword. Greatsword is a beefy weapon and trades out speed for power. Every hit with this weapon is slow and decisive, and you will feel the raw power of this weapon not only through the insanely high damage numbers you're hitting, but also by the monster's reactions to receiving such devastating blows. This weapon possesses the highest damage attack in the game, the True Charge Slash, or as most people refer to it, the TCS. This attack is extremely high commitment and hard to pull off, but with the addition of Focus Mode in Wilds, the TCS has become significantly easier to hit. Granted, you have the foresight to pull it off in the heat of combat, or if you're taking advantage of a monster being knocked down. The Greatsword also has access to a block, which can also be used as a perfect block if timed correctly with a monster's attack. As a result, blocks and perfect blocks do have access to the new power class feature introduced in Wilds and can fend off a monster while also letting you immediately follow up with a TCS. Though this hit will not always be guaranteed, so use it after gauging spacing and the time window granted to you depending on the matchup. On top of that, Greatsword also inherited an offset attack, another new feature added in Wilds that acts as a sort of parry, where timing your attack with the monsters will see you avoid damage or minimize the damage taken depending on the move. Offsets can also send monsters reeling occasionally, which allows the Greatsword to use a follow-up attack tied specifically to the offset. You will not be able to follow this up with a TCS, but you will be one step below it. Another key feature of the Greatsword is your tackle. You can do this out of a dodge or cancel out of charge attacks with this, and it provides hyper armor to you while dishing out some blunt damage to the monster. This is good for elevating your charge slash up a level and preserving a level 3 TCS if you successfully tackle through an attack while TCS is ready to go. It's also great for setting up offset attacks on multi-hit combos from the monster. This isn't all Greatsword has to offer, but these tools are your main bread and butter. Learning all the other moves will come with time as you master the weapon, and while Greatsword may seem like a simple weapon on the surface, and for new players it absolutely is simple to learn, but it's also one of the hardest weapons to master, requiring patience and complete knowledge over the monster in order to fully control the flow of the fight. But as you get closer to mastering this weapon, you'll see just how authoritative it is in combat as you flinch, dunk, and borderline control the monster's movements with the sheer magnitude of this weapon's blows. Next in line is my personal favorite and the weapon that I've been maining since Monster Hunter World back in 2018, the Longsword. This weapon's identity in the series is that of the counter weapon. It doesn't have access to offset attacks, but it does have entirely unique counters that can be used to both level up your weapon's gauge and dish out damage. It's also a weapon that has a fun gameplay loop that typically revolves around something I'm going to call the cash out system, where you work to level up your spirit gauge to level 3, or red gauge as I call it, then spend your hard-earned levels to land a powerful burst damage move known as the Helmbreaker.
Oh. Yes.
Now let's talk about the gauge in the top left. It's very important. Now to be clear, gauge and meter are two different things. Gauge is level and color, while meter is the resource in the bar. There's two counters that can level up your gauge. The Foresight Slash, which you saw just there, which requires a little bit of meter to use in the first place, and the EI Spirit Slash, which doesn't require any resource, but does have stricter timing. And yes, roars do count as attacks, so you can counter them. These counters will be your main way of leveling up your gauge once you're familiar with the weapon. You should always aim to be in red gauge because not only do you have the ability to spend your gauges on a heavy hitting move like the Helm Splitter and its follow-up, but you also have 10% increased damage in this state. And as a new addition to the weapon in Wilds, you also have a new moveset in this state called the Crimson Slash moveset. You do want to aim to level your gauge purely through countering, but in the event the monster is down or not aggroing you, which is a concern in multiplayer, you can do certain attacks to raise the gauge level. One of these attacks is just popping a wound with your Focus Strike, the other is hitting a Spirit Round Slash, which follows your Spirit Blade combo. A quicker way to finishing your Spirit Blade combo is by doing a Fade Slash before going into it, as this will get rid of the first move, allowing you to get your Spirit Round Slash off quicker. On top of that, these moves do consume meter to do. So if you do not have enough meter, you can always hold your Spirit Blade button and manually charge up a Spirit Round Slash. This will charge up faster depending on how far along you are in your Spirit Blade combo. Your main bread and butter in red gauge is going to just be alternating between Crimson Slash and Spirit Blade, which is unfortunately a really boring combo that I hope Capcom looks into as they update the game. But you can cash out your gauge in the form of Helm Splitter as your red gauge nears its end if you want to play optimally. Also, if your opportunity for a Helm Splitter disappears while you're in the air, you can cancel out of it by sheathing your weapon mid-air. Ultimately, this is a weapon that exists far outside of the standard Monster Hunter gameplay loop compared to the other 13 weapons, so I don't recommend it to players who are new to the series, as it teaches you how to play Longsword instead of how to play Monster Hunter. But once you get a grip on the game as a whole, I can't recommend it enough, since it's my favorite weapon and most likely always will be. Countering the monsters in an all-or-nothing playstyle makes hunts feel like an elaborate dance once you get into the rhythm, and that's what made me fall in love with it back in World. Now time to dive into one of the most popular weapons in Wilds right now, the Sword and Shield. Sword and Shield is easily the most versatile weapon in the series. It's the jack of all trades in a weapon. Having very high mobility, high attack speed, blunt and severing options, the ability to use items without sheathing your weapon, aerial moves, and new to Monster Hunter Wilds, an extremely strong defensive option. There really isn't a lot of depth to this weapon mechanically, but it definitely has a large array of moves you can pull off to extend combos, reposition yourself, and punish the monster whenever an opportunity presents itself. Knowing when and where to use your punishes and how to maximize uptime on your endless flurry of attacks is where the mastering of this weapon comes in. If you're letting up on the monster for even a second when it's within reach, then this weapon is not being fully utilized. There is no attack in this game that the Sword and Shield doesn't have a tool in its kit to counter it with. If it's an unblockable attack, reposition with a sliding swipe, as this has more range to it than a normal dodge, doesn't consume stamina, has iframes, and also dishes out damage. If the attack is blockable, then just get a perfect block off, followed by the fastest follow-up to a block in the game, with Counter Slash, which is also one of your weapon's strongest single-hitting moves. You even have multiple options when you launch yourself into the air, because you can either prioritize getting a mount off on the monster by doing your basic slash while you fall, building up blunt damage on your monster's head to work towards an eventual knockout, or just doing a bunch of damage as you dig your sword into the monster's flesh and tear all the way to the ground, hitting damage ticks on the entire way down. Your standard bread and butter combo when the monster is knocked down or the opportunity presents itself is going to be the Perfect Rush, which mixes blunt and sever damage in a string of combos until you launch yourself in the air for a finishing move of your choice. Focus mode may not seem too important on this weapon, but it's actually a game changer as it allows you to strafe while attacking in the direction you're aiming. This weapon truly is one of, if not the most mobile weapon in the game, and the wide array of tools to work with makes it one of the most popular weapons in the game right now. Forgot to mention this earlier, but as a weapon that does feature a block and perfect block, this weapon can also power clash. That's basically the Sword and Shield in a nutshell. Now it's time to move on to a weapon that puts speed and viciousness above all else, the Dual Blades. These are the Dual Blades, easily one of, if not the flashiest weapons in the entire game, known for their fast-paced nature and their extreme mobility. On top of all that, it is also the one most associated with Levi from Attack on Titan because of its Heavenly Blade Dance, or as I refer to it, the Spine Rider. Dual Blades is a phenomenal weapon for beginners as it's pretty simple and as a result has a very low skill floor. That being said, all weapons have really high skill ceilings, so don't just write this off as a beginner weapon. The mastery of this weapon comes from constant resource management and keeping track of your timers. Now what do I mean by that? Well, Dual Blades have 3 modes: Demon Mode, Archdemon Mode, and new to Wilds, Boost Demon Mode. You will always start off without being in a mode, but you'll soon learn that you want the majority of your fights to be in Demon Mode, because it affords you new moves which will become your core moveset. While in Demon Mode, you will continually drain stamina just for existing, but as you land attacks, you will build up your Demon Gauge, which is your main resource that you'll need to manage, alongside stamina. You do have a primary punish attack called Blade Dance, but is commonly referred to as Demon Dance, and this attack dishes out a ton of damage. It's a 3-parter, but it also renders you almost stationary, while also spending your Demon Gauge. This is a move that is meant for punishing a knocked down monster, but as your mastery with this weapon increases, you will also be able to find windows to sneak parts of this attack in as the fight is still chaotic. Once you fully fill up your Demon Gauge while in Demon Mode, you will unlock Archdemon Mode. Archdemon Mode allows you to retain a less refined version of your Demon Mode moveset while out of Demon Mode. This is useful because it allows you to keep up your onslaught of attacks while regenning your precious stamina. Be warned, however, that using any attacks, and especially dodging while in Archdemon Mode, will eat up a bunch of your Demon Gauge, so make sure you switch back to Demon Mode when you can afford to. Dual Blades also have a perfect dodge in this game that can only be pulled off in Demon or Archdemon Mode. Successfully pulling one off will put you into Demon Boost Mode. This mode is great because it gives you more damage, but it also turns your dodges into attacks of their own, as well as giving you a corkscrew follow-up to a dodge that lets you quickly cover distance and change direction. Your Focus Strike allows you to pull off a Spine Rider, and this thing doesn't only look and feel incredibly cool, but it also lets you recover stamina while in Demon Mode, so properly managing wounds is an integral part of mastering this weapon if you want to maximize your time in Demon Mode. Dual Blades are incredibly simple weapons on the surface, but as you play with them and perfect them, you'll see that timing those dodges frequently, learning what kind of moves you're able to get away with in all of the different windows of opportunity afforded to you, and managing both your Demon Gauge and your stamina while you're showing the monster death by 1,000 cuts is where this weapon gets complex. And like I said earlier, I do recommend this weapon to new players to Monster Hunter because while it's really simple to pick up, it still teaches you how to play the game in general and lets you get off plenty of badass moments along your way to mastering this weapon. Next up, Hammer. This thing is one of 2 primary blunt options in the game, which means your job is to always be near the monster's head and knocking it out repeatedly. This weapon is incredibly simple and can be wrapped up very shortly. You have your triple Y combo, which is basically your bread and butter. It finishes with an upswing, which coincidentally is also your offset attack. You can hold to delay this move if you wish to go for an offset, or wait for a monster to position itself nicely for you. You also have a follow-up to this called your Mighty Charge, where you hold the right trigger and both your attack buttons to charge up 2 more levels before unleashing a devastating blow. This can also be used as a follow-up to your punishing combo, the Big Bang attack, but it has to be used after Big Bang 4. You can decide to use the Big Bang finisher instead though if there isn't a large enough window for you to get your Mighty Charge off. You will get more damage off if you use Mighty Charge instead, so try to keep that as your main finisher on a punish if possible. You also have different charge attacks you can send out depending on what level of charge you're at while holding your right trigger. You have full mobility while charging up your attacks and can even get iframed with a dedicated hook slinger dodge while charging, making it more mobile than it's ever been. You can also smoothly transition into a Mighty Charge directly from the level 3 charge state if you want, but I wouldn't recommend this unless a niche opportunity presents itself that warrants this, as you can access Mighty Charge from attack strings as well. The offset is kinda hard to pull off on this weapon until you get a ton of hours with this thing under your belt and start mastering the way of weaving it into your core combos naturally, which I have not. But whenever you do pull it off, it is satisfying, and you always have your hook dodge while charging as a way of survivability whenever offsets aren't an option. Hammer, much like Greatsword, can control a fight as well as the monster when you start to master this weapon and know your openings as second nature, which allows this weapon to have a strong presence on the battlefield. It used to be a hit and run style weapon before, but that style has seemingly been replaced with an aggressive style of play, for better or worse depending on what you prefer. Between getting staggers, knockouts, and offsets, you have a lot to work with here to assert authority over the monster. That's just what happens when you're the second hardest hitting weapon behind Greatsword. Your attacks have weight behind them. I do heavily recommend this weapon to new players too because of its simplicity to pick up and low skill floor. That being said, the skill ceiling is high as your defensive options are very high risk and unfortunately don't offer much in the way of reward, especially since the offset, while satisfying, does not afford you a strong punishable window. Next up, we have the Hunting Horn, and it is the goofiest weapon in the game by far. It is the only other primary blunt option in the game alongside Hammer, and on top of being a giant beat stick, it lets you instill fear into the hearts of the monsters with the horrifying power of music. While the ritualistic hymns of battle and dance may look and certainly feel goofy to pull off, that does not mean this weapon is weak by any means, and contrary to popular belief amongst newer Monster Hunter players, this weapon is not a meme weapon by any means, or a purely support weapon. It is a menace on its own, just like any other weapon. And truthfully, as someone who is by no means a master of the Horn yet, but has hundreds of hours on 90% of the weapon roster in World Rise and now Wilds, this weapon is extremely high maintenance and is one of the harder ones to master. The reason is because while you're in the heat of combat, you need to be managing your songs in the top right, which serve as buffs as well as other things like offset attacks. So while you're fighting the monster optimally, you need to be hitting it with the correct moves for the sake of damage, gauging your windows of opportunity perfectly for what songs you can pull off with given windows, and must have the foresight to set up your echo bubbles where you know the monster will be punished. It's a lot, and it's sad that most people write this weapon off as a meme weapon when they're new to the game, because this weapon is actually one of, if not the highest skill ceiling weapon in the game in my opinion, and Hunting Horn Masters are very few and far between. That being said, you do not need to be a master to have fun with this weapon because it is a control machine. Between status applications, flinches, dunks, and offsets, this weapon feels like it stun locks the monster constantly on its own once you get your echo bubbles set up. Plus, it's pretty cool to get a guitar solo for your focus strike. The focus strike and placement of echo bubbles lets you bank notes in a short amount of time, which lets you get more melodies set up quickly. Then, your performance beat plays these melodies and applies their buffs or effects. I'm using a paralysis horn here, so one of my effects is a paralysis echo wave, which builds up a ton of status on the monster and gives me a lot of paralyzes, which seems to chain perfectly into knockouts as well. By the way, echo bubbles are so important to place on the ground because any notes your horn plays while inside one causes it to reverberate and damage the monster when near the circle. This can also stack up to 3 times, so these are, once again, very important. The horn also has rhythm games built into it. The performance beat should be pressed each time your character does a head nod with the beat to do another attack and seamlessly weave an encore at the end that extends and reinforces the buffs on your melodies. You can tell when your buffs have been encored because they'll appear as purple instead of yellow. The focus strike can bank up to 5 notes, and if you time them all correctly, it will also do extra damage. And I think I'm rhythmically challenged or something because I can never get this one right, but hopefully you'll do better than me. And finally, you have your echo bubble that lets you bank up to 3 notes and is great for chaining echo waves together. That about wraps up the basics for Hunting Horn and what you should expect if you want to pick up this weapon. But I do want to bring up again that this is probably the most complex weapon in the game, in my opinion at least, and this video does not serve as a guide. So we're not getting into the extreme complexities of the weapon, and I highly recommend looking up an in-depth guide to this weapon if you want to play it optimally, because this thing is a beast. But it's also incredibly fun for people who don't desire to take the weapon that far either. Next up is Lance, a relatively simple weapon that prides itself on the ability to stand at the monster's face and poke it to death while taking whatever attacks the monster throws at you and dishing them back out through perfect guards and charge counters. This weapon has the highest defensive potential in the game and has a plethora of tools to stick to the monster like glue during a hunt and continuously attack. Your main bread and butter is basically going to be 3 pokes with a finisher. These pokes can be low pokes, high pokes, or a mix of the two, and you have a choice of 2 finishers at the end of a 3-poke string. The first finisher is a triple jab that is best used when the possibility of countering a monster's attack is not imminently available, and the second finisher is a fully charged charge counter. Releasing the charge counter right before an attack hits will do 2 retaliatory thrusts, and the second one will do a bunch of damage, making the mastery of this weapon come in the form of weaving in defensive counters into your endless onslaught of pokes, while minimalizing idle time during a hunt. You can access your charge counter at any point during your thrust combo, but it will have a higher charge the closer you are to finishing the combo. You can also do charge counters without attacking at all, but this isn't really recommended as a perfect guard affords you better attack options if your charge counter isn't charged at all, and is much safer to pull off. You can also do a dash attack that's great for running down limping monsters or closing gaps in a fight. This does a bunch of damage ticks if you continuously run into a monster, and can be turned around freely with either a finishing attack or if you simply want to run in the opposite direction. That honestly wraps up Lance. This weapon is highly aggressive for being something with the stereotype of a bulwark tank type weapon, and if you like standing your ground and getting into a grudge match with your monsters, this is definitely your type of weapon. Also, it has a really cool interaction with certain flame attacks. Gunlance time! I love Gunlance in this game, and I think it got a massive glow up and has tons of mobility, combos, defensive capabilities, and most of all, explosions. This weapon has plenty of low commitment combos for you to drop out of if it's no longer safe to continue with it. But man, when you do have a window to pull a full combo off, it feels good, especially when you put all of your faith into your weapon's ability to stagger, or as I like to call it, hero moments. This weapon isn't as counter-focused as regular Lance, and instead focuses on creating windows of opportunity for you to punish the monster with. The shield is integral to this process, as it has something called guard points woven into its attacks, which are essentially automatic guards tied to certain parts of attack animations. The mastery of this weapon definitely lies within skillful usage of guard points to keep the assault up. This is also a weapon with a lot of heft to it, so flinching the monster is common. But I mean, come on, it's a lance with explosions, so of course it was going to be impactful like that. It's a nice bread and butter combo if a long enough window's available. This weapon does have some light resource management in the top left, but shells can be reloaded quickly during combat with attacks, while wyvern stakes, the thing that dig into the monster and deal continuous damage, need to be reloaded with a manual reload, except for one attack during the combo string. That does reload it for you. Wyvern Fire is what you just saw, and is another resource in the top left that does need to be managed. There is no way to reload this, it's simply time-based. There's also a lot of mobility with this weapon because of shelling dodges now, and these can open into another great bread and butter combo that can also cover some distance if the need arises for it. Keep in mind, all of these combos are low commitment and can be dropped out of if a window disappears. This weapon is an absolute blast to use, and actually does a ton of damage too. I wouldn't say I recommend this weapon to newer players to the series because it's a lot on the surface to manage, and I think this weapon really shines when you understand and get a feel for when monsters are gonna stagger or how to make windows for yourself. But it's certainly a must-play weapon at some point in your monster hunting journey in Wilds, and if you want to take the dive with it as your first weapon, then more power to you. Out of all of the weapon changes we've seen in Wilds up to this point, I also think this weapon got the biggest glow up in Wilds compared to previous entries. So if you've tried Gunlance before and didn't care for it, I'd definitely recommend giving it another go this time around, as it has had a lot of good changes done to it that I felt were desperately needed for the weapon, at least in World. Time for the Switch Axe. This weapon is actually very beginner friendly, even though it looks a little intimidating at first glance because of its different modes. First off, you have two modes, Axe mode and Sword mode. The long gauge underneath your sharpness is the switch gauge. The smaller gauge to the lower left of that is your power axe gauge, and the small gauge to the lower right of that is your amp gauge. I know it's a lot, but bear with me, it's actually very simple. Sword mode is powerful, but using attacks in sword mode drains the switch gauge, the long one. In order to fill this gauge up, you need to land attacks while in axe mode. Certain attacks, like the axe mode finisher to your focus strike and breaking out of wild swing with an axe attack, will give you power axe mode. which increases the rate at which you fill your switch gauge when landing attacks in axe mode. The amp gauge fills up when landing hits in sword mode, and once it's filled, it will remain filled for a set duration. This increases with the power prolonger skill, and it won't drain as you perform actions like the switch gauge does. This is the most important gauge to keep filled because the amp state gives your sword attacks access to your files. Your files will give you different effects depending on the type of switch axe you're using. This means that every time you land a hit while in amped state, a follow-up explosion will happen, but it also gives you access to your zero-sum discharge and full release slash, which are your heavy hitting and very flashy moves. This weapon also has a few new defensive options in Wilds. One of them is an offset attack in axe mode, but the other one is a straight up counter while in sword mode, and you do get very little chip damage when pulling it off, but that's good for proccing certain armor skills, but it also considerably builds up your amp state when pulling it off. Your core gameplay loop is going to be building up your sword and amp states to cash out on those big finishers, because both of them give you damage resistance and hyper armor, which makes spamming them safe and they do enough damage to flinch regularly, as well as opening and tearing through any wounds in the splash zone. This weapon is very fun and simple to use, and I do honestly recommend it to newer players who want to play around with something that has a bit more going for it in the management department, but is also relatively simple to pick up. I say this for every weapon, but just because something is simple to pick up doesn't mean it's simple to master, and it's no different for switch axe. Mastery of this weapon comes from fully understanding and manipulating the position of your character with your attacks and replacing dodges with them. Managing your resources, knowing when to pull off counters, and knowing each monster's opening well enough to gauge what you can get away with in terms of finishers. It's also just such a feel-good weapon, and much like Gunlance, it has a ton of explosions, and because you're going to be landing finishers regularly as well as playing in sword mode, you're going to be getting plenty of satisfying kill shots on monsters. Alright, time to talk about the Charge Blade. Now this weapon is very fun to use, and a lot of people try to learn it because of the challenge of learning it, since it's sort of been dubbed as the most complicated weapon in the series. I and most Charge Blade mains, I believe, disagree, however, as it's actually quite simple to use. It just has a lot of moving parts, so it seems a little intimidating at first glance. They are not isolated, and they can all be woven together rather seamlessly. Hunting Horn is still far and away the most complicated weapon in the game, but that doesn't mean Charge Blade is easy to pick up, however, because contrary to possessing a shield, there's really not a lot of defensive capabilities in this weapon's moveset, and it's very much a hyper-aggressive weapon. This is another morph weapon that has a sword and shield mode and an axe mode. It does have files in the top left under your sharpness gauge that you build up by landing attacks while in sword and shield mode, and these files can be consumed to empower your sword, your shield, and to add explosions to attacks while in axe mode. This will be your primary resource that you need to manage. Luckily, these buffs last a very long time, and in Wilds, they are even crazier because you can basically fill up 10 files instead of 5, like in previous entries. You can tell when these files are ready to be locked in by their color. When they turn red, you're going to want to lock them all in to get your files stored. Be wary though, because if you keep attacking without locking in your file charges after they turn red, your attacks will start to bounce. Most of your gameplay loop is going to revolve around Savage Axe mode, which turns your axe mode attacks into saw blade type attacks that can land multiple hits per swing and can be controlled through holding your attack button input during the swing. This also procs file effects if you have them stored, which is really good for damage. There's 4 ways to activate Savage Axe mode, and they're all determined by the monster in practical scenarios. You can follow up a Perfect Guard with Savage Axe mode activation. You can follow up a Power Clash with Savage Axe mode activation. You can activate Savage Axe mode out of a Focus Strike on a wound. And lastly, you can activate Savage Axe mode through a mounted finisher. You can activate Savage Axe mode on your own if you put down a small barrel bomb and Perfect Guard the explosion, but that's not really practical. Alongside Savage Axe mode, you have the classic super amped elemental discharge, or as most people refer to it, the SAED. This is the classic move where you rear back your weapon in axe mode and slam it into the ground with full force, causing a wave of file explosions to surge to the ground in front of your attack, doing huge damage to the monster. Many people are sad because Savage Axe mode does overshadow this attack in Wilds, but one of its saving graces is the activation time out of a perfect block is really quick, meaning that if you know you're going to have ample time to pull it off after a perfect block, you can easily sneak one of these into your fight and most likely get a stagger on the monster. It's an interesting dynamic now because it used to be your punishing move that you would save until the monster was downed. But now, its purpose is to be woven pretty seamlessly into standard combat to create huge openings for the hunter. This is definitely a ceiling to strive for, though, a longer journey to mastering this weapon. This weapon is a damage machine, however, and it opens wounds non-stop with Savage Axe mode. It isn't the easiest weapon to learn, but only because it's a glass cannon type weapon, not because of its complexity. This is a good thing to learn regardless of what weapon you're playing, but I feel Chargeblade relies more on mastering the art of normal dodging than many other weapons, especially when you're in Savage Axe mode. So that is also where a lot of the skill ceiling lies when using this weapon. And basic dodges do have iframes, by the way, they just aren't as forgiving as Souls-like games, so be wary and be stricter with your timing if you wish to stay alive while keeping up the offensive. But yeah, that about covers it for Chargeblade. If you like literally sawing through monsters and shaking the earth with explosions, then this is the weapon for you. On to the last of the melee weapons, the Insect Glaive. Now this weapon has the most aerial mobility in the game and is in my opinion a trap for new players. That's not to say it's bad by any means, in fact it has one of the strongest attacks in the game right now. But it's just a bit misleading because most new players think this weapon thrives and spends the majority of the time in the air, when you in fact do way more damage if you stay on the ground. We have 3 buffs we can extract from the monster with our Kinsect. If you look at the monster with your Kinsect reticle, by holding the right trigger, you can actually see which parts of the monster provide which buffs. Each buff provides different effects, but realistically you should have all 3 buffs all the time, or else your weapon is severely underperforming. One thing is that you can actually get a point in earplugs through these buffs, which means you only need to slot 1 level of earplugs into your gear to get immunity to all roars, aside from the final boss, which is pretty handy. We actually have an interesting cash out system this time around in Wilds with Insect Glaive, with the Rising Spiral Slash. This is our hardest hitting move and one of the strongest moves in the entire mainline series, and it burns up all of our Kinsect buffs in order to execute it. Now it should be able to easily regather these buffs during the move itself if you've positioned yourself well on the monster, but unfortunately in practice this is extremely unreliable and actually overwrites unique buffs for duplicates, which I think is a major oversight and needs to be addressed as it renders the regathering part of this move useless the majority of the time. As a semi-reliable fix, a lot of us have been targeting wounds in mid-air with our Focus Strike immediately after our Rising Spiral Slash, because this also replenishes all of our buffs. But Capcom does plan on making wounds less frequent, at least on Apexes, in the future, so I don't know how that will affect the flow of the weapon when we won't have as many readily accessible wounds to pop in order to re-up our buffs after a Rising Spiral Slash. In order to do a Rising Spiral Slash, you must first do a move that requires you to hold circle or B in order to charge it up. This attack can be charged while performing other moves and released whenever you want to execute it, and it can also be performed in mid-air to do a fast and powerful dive to the ground. These moves also have offset capabilities, which lets you pull off some cool counterattacks while giving you an opening for a juicy Rising Spiral Slash follow-up. Overall, I think this is the best version of the weapon we've ever had in terms of gameplay, but many Insect Glaive users, including myself, complain about the feel of the controller in your hand while playing, since you basically need to be holding the left trigger and circle or B the entire hunt. People have turned on toggle focus mode when using this weapon, as well as suggesting using paddles for your controller, or just straight up learning how to use keyboard and mouse with it, as it really is quite uncomfortable to play this weapon optimally, unless changing some settings or hardware around. But if you're either unbothered by that or have a sufficient solution to it, I actually think this weapon is very beginner friendly, as long as you remember that you belong on the ground just as much, if not more, than you belong in the air while using this weapon. It's got a lot going for it, and it was my first ever weapon in the series back in World. So if you feel like doing fancy acrobatics, mounting the monster like crazy, and becoming a tornado of death when using Rising Spiral Slash, this is the weapon for you. Getting into ranged weapons, we have Light Bowgun. Now, there really isn't much to talk about regarding bowguns because they really aren't all that complex, but they are also always some of the, if not the strongest weapons in the games, So let's start by talking about the more mobile of the two, the light bowgun. This is a weapon capable of peppering monsters with damage and has a wide array of ammo options to choose from. You're primarily going to be sticking to Pierce unless you want to focus in on a monster's weakness with elemental ammo, which is outstanding as far as elemental damage is in Wilds. The allure of this weapon comes from its mobility, as you're able to constantly stay out of the monster's reach without ever giving up any offensive pressure. But on top of that, Wilds brings something else to the light bowgun's arsenal, and that is rapid fire mode. This is your rapid fire gauge. When you activate it, you will enter rapid fire mode. You build up this gauge by landing hits normally, and once activated, it burns gauge to enhance your shots significantly. Not only that, but it also gives you access to an incredible tool called the Burst Step, which weaves a strong attack into a strong dodge, allowing you to become nearly untouchable once you get a feel for it. It does take a while to get this down, as it's activated by hitting the right trigger and X or A together, and has some strict timing that prevents you from just button mashing. But once you do learn it and start to chain this move together, it is a game changer, but it's only really worth it when using Pierce ammo. For elemental ammo, you'll probably still just want to shoot normally when in rapid fire mode. That's mainly your bread and butter, but a lot of bowgun users are upset this time around because spread ammo, something I haven't talked about in this video, isn't really viable anymore. Balance changes are a potential for the future though, so there is a chance that it could be back in the meta in the future, so just stay tuned for that. And I do want to remind you that this video is not meant to be an extensive guide, but more so a letter of introduction for all of the weapons, so I won't be covering all the different types of ammos and their viability. To go along with that, bowguns are also modular, meaning that they have different mods and effects and ammos that work better with each different one. So if you're curious about all the ins and outs that we won't be covering here, I highly recommend checking out an in-depth bowgun guide, as that will be able to teach you things that I could never. Also, important to point out that your elemental ammo is very strong, and it is limited. You can only take so much into a hunt, so it's recommended to take materials needed to craft the ammo into the hunt with you as well, and craft more on the fly when you run out. But since we can carry two weapons in Wilds, it's quite beneficial to have your Pierce bowgun with you as a backup plan for when you run out of elemental ammo and the crafting materials entirely, making the secondary weapon feature very useful for bowguns. The light bowgun also has two types of special ammo shots. First, you have your adhesive shot that sticks to the target and does a delayed series of slicing cuts, with the final amount and damage varying depending on how many times you shoot the adhesive shot with other types of ammo before it starts to detonate. The second is your standard Wyvern Blast ammo, which is a landmine you plant into the ground at your feet. This can be detonated through your and your allies' attacks, which should probably be the primary way of detonating, as it can be a bit finicky when monsters walk over it. Your special ammo is tied to the giant ammo symbol above your rapid fire gauge, but these moves really aren't all that important and actually are quite disruptive to the flow of combat, so the best time to use them is to open a fight rather than during one. There's also 3 other ammo symbols above your rapid fire gauge right next to your special ammo. These serve as focus shots, and they will regen over time, just like your special ammo. You really don't want to use your focus shots too much though, because they are also a loss in damage unless you're trying to punish a monster's vulnerability after it does a punishable move. One other thing that I want to talk about is critical distance, which is the most important piece of information for all 3 ranged weapons. When your reticle is a double orange circle with lines sticking out the side, this means you are in critical distance and will do maximum damage. You always want to be in critical distance or your damage will be pitiful in comparison, so you don't want to get too close or too far depending on the ammo you're using. That about covers the basics for light bowgun. Playing the weapon is quite simple, but understanding some behind the scene nuances that modular weapons bring with them is where it's really important. Its mastery will come from being able to properly gauge distance from the monster to maintain a strong position capable of not only affording you survivability, but also the ability to throw a never-ending stream of deadly projectiles the monster's way. So if close combat isn't really your thing, and the idea of becoming a slippery serenade of death is, then light bowgun is the weapon for you. Alright, time for the heavy bowgun. Now, if light bowgun is a mobile hit-and-run burst weapon, then heavy bowgun is the other side of the coin. This thing is a sturdy and almost stationary barrage of bullets. It is constantly competing for number 1 in terms of damage in the mainline games, and if you're good at reading monster part values, which is not inherently in itself easy, it makes this weapon one of the easiest weapons to play as well, once you get a feel for bowguns in general, that is. Now, you might be wondering, How could it be easy if we aren't as mobile as Light Bowgun? Well, that's because we have a built-in shield that is always actively guarding whenever we aren't shooting, and on top of that, we are able to manually guard with it in order to achieve perfect blocks. We can enter power clashes with this weapon, and even though it's hard to use reactively because of how long it takes to set up, we also have an offset attack. Similarly to Light Bowgun, we also have a gauge in the bottom right that builds up to something we call our ignition mode, of which we have a few changes, but it's primarily going to be used to enable your Gatling gun-like barrage of shots called the Wyvern Heart Ignition. This is your primary source of damage whenever it's up, especially if you aren't using elemental ammo, and it chunks the monsters. Unfortunately, it does leave you quite vulnerable, so you'll see many heavy bowgun users bring flash pods with them to keep the monster disoriented so they can spam this move. And honestly, that's where the mastery of this weapon starts to come in. As a heavy bowgun user, you want your overwhelming amount of damage to ignore as much of the fight as you can, and keep the monster from getting a say. Between flash pods, your ability to do an insane amount of damage in a small time window, and the ability to aim the amount of damage to specific parts of the weapon lets you break wounds, break parts, dunk flying monsters, and consistently flinch the thing to death. Oftentimes when you see speedruns, it's not uncommon for a monster to get stun locked to death by a heavy bowgun user without ever throwing out a proper attack in the hunter's direction. As with Light Bowgun, this is indeed a modular weapon, so you can change around mods to get the bowgun to where you want it, including changes to ignition mode that allow you to switch over to a piercing type of ignition mode instead of a Gatling gun type. But most of the time, at least in the current meta, Wyvern Heart will come out on top by a mile. Plus, who doesn't love having a Gatling gun? I know I've made it seem like this weapon is just easy mode, and dedicated heavy bowgun mains will tell you that it is easy mode. But realistically, in order for this weapon to shine, you need to understand something that isn't as important on other weapons, and that's the hit zone values. Getting good at guessing when a monster is going to flinch, or a part will break, it really is important on this weapon, as it's what allows you to buckle down and commit to an attack instead of running away or going on the defensive in certain scenarios, and those moments feel great when you pull them off. If you're someone who loves to cause chaotic destruction from afar and yearn for damage above all else, then heavy bowgun is the weapon for you. And last, but certainly not least, in fact, it's one of my favorite weapons in the series, the bow. This thing is all the excitement of a fast-paced melee weapon packed into a ranged weapon, and revolves around fast-paced gameplay, perfect dodges, and good aim. Instead of having ammo, it instead has coatings, and unlike bowguns, spread, or close ranged as it's called, is actually the go-to coating on this weapon, which encourages staying close to the danger. The bow's whole deal revolves around charge levels, and you can raise charge levels through holding the charge, getting perfect dodges, or by shooting consecutively. But what most bow mains do is something called dash dancing, which is essentially dodging as soon as you hold your trigger to pocket a charge before shooting, and then immediately following it up with a power shot and even a power volley after, if the window allows it. In Wilds, you also have a tracer arrow that you can place on the monster, and all your shots will go to where the tracer arrow is, including your special shots like Dragon Piercer and 1,000 Dragons. This also makes your shots default to whatever level charge you had when firing the tracer for its duration. So use this to cut the ramp up section of dash dancing out entirely and just start at level 3. It's also quite useful for hitting small or hard to reach places on monsters consistently. Wilds also makes it so you can have infinite coatings without needing to craft at all. Your gauge is in the bottom right, and it's called your trick arrow gauge, and landing attacks as well as perfect dodging will fill this gauge. Instead of crafting and using limited coatings for your bow, you can now consume trick gauge to load any coatings that are compatible with your bow indefinitely as long as you have gauge. It's also very easy to maintain trick arrow gauge. You can almost ignore it entirely if you're attacking often. It's also what's used to fire your tracer arrows. Dragon Piercer, at least before the previous title update, was insanely strong. It has since been nerfed heavily, but is still a very strong option / follow-up to a power shot volley when a window allows for it. But it is a bit conditional because this shot pierces down the entirety of a monster, so it's best used when you can get as many hits as you can, usually when you can get a clean shot from head to tail. Also, if you take the time to build up a bunch of wounds, you can easily stun lock a monster by cycling between focus strikes and Dragon Piercer shots for a ton of damage even in its nerfed state. And honestly, that's really all the basics of bow. And if you like to live on the edge and dance around the battlefield while spitting out tons of arrows and having multiple damage options for all types of positional scenarios, then bow is the weapon for you. Alright, that covers all 14 weapons, and I hope you were able to find the right weapon for you. Thank you for watching, really, it means a ton to me, and a ton of work went into this because I had to learn all the weapons, their movesets in their entirety, their metas, and all the nuances in such a short amount of time. And basically what I'm trying to say is this video took a lot to make, and I'm really grateful that you took a chance on me and made it to the end. Also, massive shout out to every one of these weapon channels on the Monster Hunter Gathering Hall Discord server, because they are filled with experts on each weapon down to the motion values on each of their attacks, and they are all very friendly and willing to share their knowledge. They also have full-fledged Google Doc guides for each weapon in their respective channel, and as I said multiple times throughout this video, we won't be getting into the thick of each weapon in this video, so if you're looking for extensive details on each weapon, I'd start here, as you will come out more knowledgeable and become a better player because of it. And also, if you're ever wanting to catch me live, I do stream on Twitch, and you can find it in the description below. I hope you all have a phenomenal day. I'm Haderaxe, signing out. Peace.